There was something about the way she stood, unshaken, unafraid, while the whole town tried to break her. Clara Thornton wasn't what they expected, and maybe that's exactly why they feared her. But who is she really? And why does a silent mountain man begin to question everything he's been told? This is not just a story. It's a revelation waiting to unfold.
The wind in Harrow Creek didn't just blow, it bit. It stripped the weak right down to the bone. Clara Maeve Thornton wasn't weak. She was just large. And in the Montana Territory of 1878, folks forgave a whole lot of sins. They forgave rustlers. They forgave drunks. They forgave men who ran out on their families. But they did not forgive a woman for taking up more space than they thought she deserved, especially a woman who came through the post. Clara stood on the front porch of her ranch. Her boots were planted firm on the rough-hewn pine boards. The boards she had nailed down herself. Her hands, thick and heavily calloused, rested on her hips. She stared at the two men standing in her front yard. Amos Sterling, the town banker, a man who smelled of cheap bay rum and expensive cigars. Beside him stood a slick-suited lawyer from Helena, holding a leather satchel tight to his chest like Clara might try to eat it. Arthur was in the ground just 2 weeks. Her husband, a good man but a frail one. And now the vultures were circling. "It's just the way of the law, Clara," Amos said. He had that smooth, practiced tone, the voice of a man who stole pennies from blind beggars and called it charity. "Arthur died without a proper will. The estate goes to his closest blood relative, his brother, Silas." Clara didn't blink. "Silas has never set foot in Montana. He didn't build this place. I did." Amos sighed. He looked her up and down. His eyes lingered on the broadness of her shoulders, the thick curve of her waist beneath her heavy cotton dress. It was a look Clara knew well. It was the look of a man measuring a draft horse. "Be reasonable, Clara," Amos said, dropping the fake sympathy. "Look at you. This is a massive property. It requires a swift step, agility, stamina. Well, let's be honest. You're a mail-order bride, and a heavy one at that. You don't have the physical capacity to run a ranch this size. Silas will take over. It's better for everyone." The wind howled, kicking up dust around the hems of Clara's skirt. She didn't weep. She didn't shout. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold mountain air fill her wide chest. Then she took a step forward. The porch boards didn't creak. They held her weight perfectly, because she had built them to. "Amos Sterling," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. It rang out like an iron bell across the empty yard. "You listen to me, and you listen well." Amos took a half-step back. He didn't mean to, but he did. "You look at my size, and you look at my title as a mail-order bride, and you think that strips me of my humanity," Clara said, staring a hole right through him. "But let me make the facts of life very clear to you today. A person's worth is not dictated by the shape of their body. Respecting a woman's physical form, no matter its size, is a basic human decency. And my capability is not determined by your narrow prejudice." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Clara turned her fierce gaze on him. "You speak of the law," she continued, her words rhythmic and hard. "But you ignore fundamental human rights. The right to own the fruits of one's own honest labor is a basic human right. Equality isn't a gift you hand out to the people who look the way you want them to. It is earned through sweat and blood. My sweat watered this ground. Discrediting my physical labor just because my body doesn't fit your cruel standard of beauty is discrimination. You will not erase my existence, and you will not steal my land, simply because you don't like looking at me." Silence fell over the yard, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Amos opened his mouth, closed it. His face flushed a dark, ugly red. He wasn't used to women talking back. He certainly wasn't used to them delivering a sermon on human rights in his face. We'll see what the judge has to say about your rights. Amos sneered finally, tipping his hat with venom. Pack your bags, Clara. You have until the end of the month. They turned. They climbed into their buggy. They drove away, leaving a trail of kicked-up dust in their wake. Clara watched them go until they were nothing but a speck on the horizon. She turned and walked back into the quiet house. It was cold inside. The fire had died down to embers. Clara walked into the kitchen and sat at the heavy oak table. She closed her eyes. Suddenly, she wasn't in her kitchen anymore. It was March 1876, 2 years ago. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The train station in Harrow Creek. She had stepped off the Union Pacific line holding nothing but a single wooden trunk and a heart full of desperate hope. She had answered Arthur Thornton's advertisement in the Cincinnati paper. Wanted. A capable woman for a Montana ranch. She needed a home. He needed a wife. It was a transaction. But nobody warned her about the welcoming committee. She remembered standing on the platform. The dust. The noise. And then the sudden, sharp silence of the townspeople when they saw her. They were expecting a delicate, fragile thing, a porcelain doll to rescue. Instead, they got Clara, tall, broad, solid. She remembered the storekeeper's wife, Martha, standing just a few feet away, looking at Clara as if she were a prize hog at a county fair. Lord Almighty, Martha had whispered loudly to her friends. Arthur ordered a bride to nurse him, but this one might collapse the floorboards first. She certainly ain't gonna fit on one of his horses. The laughter. It hadn't been loud. It had been muffled, hidden behind gloved hands and lace fans. But that made it worse. It was the laughter of people who thought she was too stupid or too slow to notice they were mocking her. Clara had stood on that platform, her cheeks burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could have cried. She could have gotten right back on the train. Instead, she had bent down. She wrapped her thick, strong hands around the leather handles of her heavy oak trunk, a trunk that took 2 porters to load in Ohio. She hoisted it up, her muscles screaming, and carried it herself down the wooden steps. She walked right past Martha. She didn't walk fast. She didn't walk slow. She walked with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of a woman who knew exactly what her body was capable of enduring. That was 2 years ago. Arthur had been bedridden almost from the day she arrived. His lungs were failing. He couldn't work the land. So Clara did. She dug the wells. She planted the oats. She mended the fences. She stayed awake through the freezing nights to deliver calves. She built the ranch while the town laughed at the fat mail-order bride behind her back. Clara opened her eyes. The kitchen was still quiet. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, brown leather ledger. The edges were frayed. The spine was cracked. It was the most valuable thing she owned. She grabbed a pencil. She flipped past pages and pages of meticulous notes. Seed costs, harvest yields, veterinary remedies she had learned and perfected. She found a blank line at the bottom of the current page. March 14th, 1878. She wrote. Her handwriting was sharp, precise. Amos Sterling came to take the ranch. Attempted to use my size and status as a woman to prove incompetence. I informed him of my rights. He threatened eviction. She closed the book. It wasn't a diary. There were no tears on these pages. There were no feelings. It was a weapon. It was an undeniable, irrefutable record of her existence. Amos wanted to pretend she hadn't built this place. The town wanted to pretend she was nothing but a punchline. But the ledger remembered. And one day the ledger was going to speak. Clara stood up. The grief for Arthur was a heavy stone in her chest. The fear of Amos Sterling was a cold knot in her stomach. But fear didn't get the chores done. Grief didn't feed the livestock. She tied her hair back. She grabbed her heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door. The barn was cold. It smelled of sweet hay, manure, and old leather. It was the only place in Montana where Clara felt like she truly belonged. The animals didn't judge her waistline. They only cared if her hands were gentle and the feed was on time. She walked to the back stall. The grain sacks were stacked high. £50 each. A normal man might struggle with one. A society lady wouldn't even attempt it. Clara grabbed the coarse burlap ears of the top sack. She bent her knees. She engaged her core. With a sharp exhale, she hoisted the 50-pound sack of grain up against her chest. She didn't stagger. She just carried it. She walked out into the pale afternoon sun, heading toward the feeding troughs. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Her muscles burned, a good clean ache. This was her land. This was her dirt. She had paid for it in sweat. She dumped the grain into the long wooden trough. A cloud of golden dust plumed into the air. As the dust settled, Clara stopped. She wasn't alone. Down by the eastern fence line, about 50 yards away, a man was sitting on a massive roan horse. He hadn't made a sound. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, blending into the shadows of the tall pines. He wore a heavy buckskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a town man. He looked like the mountain itself had grown legs and climbed onto a saddle. Clara froze. She wiped her brow with the back of her dusty hand. The man didn't move to help her. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't shout a greeting. He just sat there, watching. He had watched her lift the 50-pound sack. He had watched her carry it without a single tremor of weakness. For a long moment, the heavy woman covered in grain dust and the quiet man from the mountains simply looked at each other across the frozen Montana dirt. Then the man pulled gently on his reins. The roan horse turned. Without a word, he rode away, disappearing into the tree line. Clara watched the empty space where he had been. Her heart beat a strange, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he had been told about her. But for the very first time since she had stepped off that train in Harrow Creek, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 2 long years. She felt seen. Caleb Lawson trusted 3 things in this world: his rifle, his horse, and the absolute silence of the high mountains. He did not trust people. 12 years living up at the snow line will do that to a man. People talked too much. They lied too much. They smiled to your face and kept a knife behind their back. Caleb had learned that the hard way. He had the scars to prove it. Folks in Harrow Creek called him the Mountain Man. They said it with a mix of respect and fear. He only came down when he needed coffee, salt, or ammunition. He didn't linger. He didn't make small talk. But this time was different. This time he came down because of a letter. It was from an old army buddy, a man Caleb had trusted with his life a long time ago. The letter asked for a favor. A man named Amos Sterling needed an independent scout to assess a property, the Thornton Ranch. The widow running the place is a problem, the letter had read. She's a mail-order bride, a heavy, sluggish woman. She's demanding, lazy, and she doesn't know her place. Sterling needs a man who isn't from town to step in and oversee the spring planting before she ruins the soil. I thought of you. Caleb read the letter, and he believed it. He folded it up, put it in his saddlebag, and rode down the mountain. That was his first mistake, not a malicious one, but a mistake born from a heart that had been broken too many times. He had forgotten how to check the facts. He just assumed the worst. He met Amos Sterling at the Harrow Creek Saloon on a Tuesday morning. Sterling bought him a coffee. He talked for an hour straight. He talked about legal proceedings. He talked about protecting the estate's value. But he never quite looked Caleb in the eye. "She's a difficult woman, Caleb," Amos said, leaning across the sticky wooden table. "Arthur Thornton brought her out here to nurse him. But well, you'll see for yourself. She's a massive woman, slow. She doesn't have the physical stamina to run a ranch. She's stubborn, though. Refuses to step aside for Arthur's rightful heir." Caleb sipped his black coffee. He didn't say much, he just listened. He listened to what Amos said, and he listened to what Amos didn't say. Amos didn't say what Clara Thornton had actually done wrong. He didn't talk about crop failures. He didn't talk about sick cattle. He just talked about how she looked, how she didn't fit. Still, Caleb had his orders. He was being paid to do a job. They rode out to the Thornton Ranch that afternoon. The wind was sharp. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Caleb rode his roan horse a few paces behind Amos's buggy. As they crested the hill overlooking the valley, Caleb pulled back on his reins. He stopped. He just sat in the saddle and looked. He had seen 100 ranches in the Montana Territory. He knew what a dying farm looked like. He knew what lazy land looked like. This wasn't it. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He looked at the main barn. It was built facing southeast. The roof had a slight, deliberate pitch. Not built by a master carpenter, maybe, but built by someone who understood the brutal winter wind. That roof would shed heavy snow perfectly. He looked at the winter pens. They were placed high up on a dry ridge, away from the mud. The cattle inside looked healthy, thick coats, clear eyes. Then he looked at the well. It sat on the north corner of the property. Caleb knew how to read the earth. He knew where the deep underground springs hid beneath the rocks. That well was placed in the exact right spot to pull water during the driest part of July. You didn't guess a spot like that. You had to watch the land for a full season to know where to dig. Arthur Thornton had been bedridden for years. A lazy, sluggish woman didn't build this. Caleb kept his mouth shut. He nudged his horse forward. But in his gut, a quiet alarm began to ring. The map he had been given was wrong. They found Clara Thornton out near the fencing. She was exactly the woman Caleb had watched lifting that 50-pound sack of grain the day before. Up close, she was even more striking. She wasn't delicate. She didn't have a tiny waist or fragile hands. She was tall, broad, and deeply solid. Her auburn hair was tied back tight. Her face was flushed with cold and hard work. She didn't stop what she was doing when they rode up. She finished tying off a thick coil of barbed wire. Then she turned. She wiped her hands on her heavy canvas apron. "Clara," Amos said. His voice was loud, too loud, the voice of a man trying to sound in charge. "This is Caleb Lawson. I brought him to the property." Clara didn't look at Amos. She looked straight at Caleb. Her eyes were a piercing, clear brown. They didn't hold a single ounce of fear. They held the cool, calculating gaze of a woman assessing a threat. "And what exactly is Mr. Lawson doing on my property?" Clara asked. Her voice was rhythmic, calm. "He is here to act as an overseer," Amos said, puffing out his chest. "The bank and the heir have agreed. Given your physical limitations and your lack of experience, we cannot risk the spring planting. Mr. Lawson will manage the daily operations until the legal matters are settled." Caleb watched her. He expected her to yell. He expected her to cry. He expected her to act like the difficult, unruly woman Amos had described. Instead, Clara Thornton stood taller. She looked from Amos to Caleb. Then she spoke. Her words were sharp and deliberate. "Mr. Sterling? Mr. Lawson?" Clara said. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried perfectly on the wind. "Let me educate you both right now, because you clearly need it. A woman's physical size is not a legal measure of her competence. Judging my right to this land based on how my body looks is a blatant violation of basic equality. The law requires you to look at the assets I produced, not at my waistline. My body is not up for your public debate. It is the tool that built this ranch. Every fence post, every dug well, and every surviving calf is my legal proof. So unless you have a court order signed by a judge stripping me of my managerial rights, you are trespassing." Amos opened his mouth. He sputtered. "Now see here, Clara." "No, you see here," Clara interrupted. Her tone was like struck flint. "Equality means my labor is valued the exact same as a man's. You will not stand on the dirt I plowed and tell me I'm physically unfit just because I don't look the way you want a woman to look. I want to see the legal authorization. Now." Caleb stood perfectly still. The wind blew. The horses shifted. Amos didn't have a signed court order. He just had threats. He had banked on her being intimidated. He had banked on her backing down because 2 men showed up to bully her. He banked wrong. Amos's face turned purple. "You are making a terrible mistake, Clara. The judge will hear of this stubbornness." "Tell him," Clara said simply. "Tell him I asked for the law." She didn't wait for them to leave. She turned her back on them. She picked up her heavy coil of wire and walked away down the fence line. Amos swore under his breath. He yanked his horse's reins. "You see?" he hissed at Caleb. "Unreasonable. Completely unreasonable." Caleb didn't answer. He watched Clara walk away. Her stride was even, unbroken. Amos thought her demand for legal papers was unreasonable. But Caleb wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what it was. It was the action of a woman who knew the law better than the men trying to steal from her. He looked down at his calloused hands holding the leather reins. His old friend had lied to him. Amos had lied to him. Caleb had ridden down that mountain with the wrong map. And now, looking at the sprawling, perfectly maintained ranch built by the hands of a woman the town treated like dirt, he realized something terrifying. He was standing on the wrong side of the fight. 4 in the morning. It was always 4 in the morning. Black as pitch outside. Cold enough to crack a stone. Clara Thornton didn't need a clock. Her bones knew the time. She woke up in the dark. The house was freezing. She didn't lie in bed and feel sorry for herself. She didn't waste time wishing things were different. She threw off the heavy wool quilt. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet hit the cold pine floor. Her back ached. A deep, dull throb near the base of her spine. A reminder of the 50-pound sacks. A reminder of the wells she had dug. She stretched. She dressed in the dark. Heavy cotton dress, thick wool stockings, her worn leather boots. By 4:30, she was in the barn. She lit a single kerosene lantern. The soft yellow light pushed back the shadows. The air inside was warm from the bodies of the animals. They shifted in their stalls. They huffed in the cold air. Clara walked straight to the back pen, to the oldest cow in the herd, Bessie. Bessie was 12. She had a bad left leg. If someone didn't check on her first thing, she would try to stand, slip, and smash her heavy-horned head against the wooden gate. Clara knew this. She had watched Bessie for 2 years. She checked the latch. She laid down fresh straw. She patted the old cow's thick neck. Then, she moved to the calves. The water in their troughs had frozen overnight. Clara grabbed an iron bar. She broke the ice. She carried buckets of warm water from the house to mix it in. The new calves needed temperate water. It kept them from catching a chill. No one taught her that. She figured it out by watching, by trying, by failing, and by trying again. When the sun finally began to bleed over the eastern ridge, turning the sky a pale, icy blue, Clara walked back to the house. She started the stove. She boiled water for oatmeal. At exactly 6 o'clock, there was a quiet knock at the back door. Clara opened it. Samuel stood there. He was 13, skinny as a rail. He wore a coat that was 3 sizes too big, handed down from a father who had died in a logging accident 2 years prior. He worked on the neighboring farm, but he came to Clara's house every morning before his chores. "Morning, Miss Clara," Samuel mumbled, looking at his boots. "Morning, Samuel. Come in by the stove. It's freezing out there." She handed him a steaming bowl of oatmeal. She always made extra. Samuel ate it fast. Too fast, the way a boy eats when he doesn't know if he'll get supper. Clara sat across from him. She pulled out a small slate board and a piece of chalk. She taught him numbers. She taught him how to read a ledger. Nobody asked her to do it. The town didn't care if an orphan boy could do math. But Clara cared. It was an injustice she could actually fix. Samuel finished his bowl. He wiped his mouth. He looked at the slate, but his eyes were far away. "Miss Clara?" he asked softly. "Yes, Samuel." He hesitated. He picked at a loose thread on his oversized coat. "Yesterday, down at the Mercantile, I heard Mrs. Higgins talking. She was talking about you." Clara went perfectly still. She kept her face calm. "What did she say?" "She called you a name. She said you were just a fat mail-order bride. She said you didn't belong running a place like this. She said Arthur made a mistake buying you." Samuel looked up. His young eyes were angry, but confused. "Why do they say those things? You work harder than anybody." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the boy. She saw the genuine confusion in his face. He was learning how the world worked. He was learning how cruel people could be. She set the chalk down. She leaned forward. Outside the window, near the side of the house, a shadow moved. It was Caleb Lawson. He had ridden out early to inspect the western fence line. He had stopped near the house to tighten his saddle girth. He heard the boy's question through the thin glass. He froze. Inside the kitchen, Clara's voice was clear. It wasn't angry. It was steady and full of conviction. "Listen to me, Samuel," Clara said verbally, making sure the boy looked her in the eye. "I need you to hear this and remember it for the rest of your life. People mock bodies that don't look like theirs to hide their own deep insecurities. It is an easy, cruel way to feel powerful. But they are wrong." She pointed to her own broad shoulders, her thick arms. "The true worth of a human being lies in their compassion and their honest labor, not in their waistline. Our bodies are tools for survival and creation. They carry us through the cold, they dig the wells, they tend the sick. Every body deserves respect, no matter its shape or its size. Treating someone poorly because of how they look is a failure of their character, not a measure of my worth." Samuel nodded slowly. The confusion in his eyes started to clear. "Don't ever judge a person's story by the thickness of its cover, Samuel," Clara finished. "And don't ever let anyone tell you that your physical form makes you less of a human being. Equality means we look at what a person builds, not what they weigh. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said softly. "I understand." Outside, Caleb stood by his horse. His chest felt tight. He had heard every word. The words hit him like a physical blow. People mock bodies to hide their own insecurities. He thought about the men in the saloon. He thought about Amos Sterling. He thought about his own assumptions when he read that letter. He had been a part of it. He had let the poison of town gossip dictate how he viewed a woman he had never even met. He felt a deep, burning shame flush up the back of his neck. He didn't knock on the door. He quietly led his horse away from the house. He needed to think. By mid-morning, the sun had burned off the worst of the frost. Clara was out on the front porch churning butter. It was hard, rhythmic work. Her arms moved in a steady, unyielding motion. A buckboard wagon rattled up the long dirt driveway. It wasn't Amos. It wasn't the town women. It was Sage Mitchell. Sage was 67 years old. Her mother was Cheyenne, her father a Canadian trapper. She lived on the edge of town in a small cabin folks pretended not to see. She had no legal power in Harrow Creek. She couldn't vote. She couldn't sign property papers. But Sage had a memory like a steel trap. She parked her wagon. She climbed down slowly, leaning on a carved wooden cane. Clara stopped churning. A genuine smile broke across her face, the first real smile she had worn in weeks. "Morning, Sage," Clara called out. "Morning, Clara." Sage walked up the steps. She didn't knock. She just sat down in the wooden rocking chair next to the churn. "Town's buzzing today. Amos is telling anyone who will listen that you're fighting him. Says you're too heavy to be reasonable." Clara wiped her brow. "Amos says a lot of things, mostly lies." "I know," Sage said. Her dark eyes, surrounded by deep wrinkles, watched Clara work. "I remember the day you got off that train. I remember Martha laughing at you. I remember you picking up that trunk." Clara looked away, embarrassed. "It was a heavy trunk." "It wasn't the trunk, child," Sage said softly. "It was the dignity. I saw it. I saw you dig that well. I saw you stay up 3 nights running when the fever hit the herd last winter. They don't write that down in their bank ledgers. They don't record the sweat. They only record the names of the men." Clara resumed churning. Thump, thump, thump. I write it down, Clara said. I have a ledger. Sage nodded slowly. Keep writing, because when the time comes, my memory and your ink are going to be the only thing standing between you and the wolves. Up on the ridge, hidden in the tree line, Caleb Lawson sat on his horse. He had his spyglass out. He watched the old woman and Clara talking on the porch. He didn't need to hear the words. He saw the respect. Amos Sterling had told Caleb this woman was demanding, unreasonable, lazy, a burden on the land. But Caleb was a scout. He knew how to read the signs. He saw the perfectly maintained barn. He saw the healthy cattle. He saw the orphan boy leaving with a full stomach and a lesson in his head. And now he saw the oldest, wisest woman in the valley, sitting on Clara's porch like an honored guest. Caleb lowered the glass. The town was blind. They were looking right at a masterpiece and calling it dirt because they didn't like the frame. Caleb took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. He didn't know how he was going to fix the mistake he had made, but he knew exactly where he had to start. Harrow Creek was not a town built for the weak. It was a town of mud, rough pine, and hard judgments. Clara Thornton knew this. She dressed accordingly. She didn't put on mourning black. She put on her best working dress. Heavy dark blue cotton, sturdy leather boots. She pinned her hair back so tight it pulled at her scalp. She took her brown leather ledger from the kitchen table. She held it like a shield. She walked into town. 2 miles. The cold spring wind snapped at her skirts. She didn't hitch the wagon. She wanted to walk. She needed the rhythm of her own boots on the dirt road to steady her pulse. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building, the only brick building in town. She walked up the wooden steps. They groaned under her weight. Clara didn't try to step lightly. She belonged here just as much as any man. Judge Aldridge sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a graying man, tired eyes, hands stained with ink. He looked up when Clara walked in. He didn't look surprised. In a town this small, news traveled faster than a prairie fire. Mrs. Thornton, the judge said softly. He gestured to a wooden chair. Take a seat. I prefer to stand, Your Honor, Clara said. She walked to the desk. She placed the brown leather ledger right in the center of the green felt blotter. Amos Sterling came to my property, Clara said. Her voice was calm, measured. He informed me that the estate will pass to Silas Thornton. He informed me that my physical stature and my arrival via mail order render me unfit to manage the land. He intends to push an eviction. Judge Aldridge sighed. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Clara, the law of inheritance is rigid. Without a will, the bloodline takes precedence. Amos is representing the bank and the heir. It's a matter of legal protocol. I am not here to argue bloodlines, Clara said. She tapped the leather cover of the book. I am here to argue sweat and investment. I want this ledger officially entered into the court record. The judge frowned. A ledger of what? A ledger of the truth, Clara said flatly. 2 years of seed costs, 2 years of veterinary remedies, the architectural plans for the winter barn, the depth and location of the north well. Every single hour of physical labor I poured into that dirt while my husband lay dying. If Silas Thornton takes that land, he takes my uncompensated labor. The judge looked at the book. Then he looked at Clara. The court doesn't typically record the daily chores of a wife, Clara. They aren't chores, Clara corrected, her tone hardening. It is agricultural engineering. It is physical labor that increased the property value by nearly 300%. I want my work officially recorded, so that when history looks back at the Thornton Ranch, it doesn't just see a fat mail-order bride who was tossed out into the snow. It sees the builder. Judge Aldridge stared at her for a long time. The clock ticked on the wall. Finally, he reached out. He opened the ledger. He flipped through the pages. His eyes widened slightly at the precise, undeniable math. I will enter it into the public record as an addendum to the estate files, the judge said quietly. But Clara... It won't stop Amos Sterling. A book cannot stop a bank. No, Clara said, taking her hand off the desk. But it stops them from lying about me in the dark. She turned and walked out of the office. The air outside felt suddenly warmer, a small victory. But victories in Harrow Creek were always short-lived. She stepped down off the courthouse porch onto the wooden boardwalk. 3 women were standing outside the Mercantile across the street: Martha, the storekeeper's wife, and 2 of her closest gossips. They were holding parasols. They wore corsets pulled tight, making them look like fragile, angry birds. They saw Clara. They stopped talking. Then the whispers started. Loud whispers, designed to be heard. "Look at her," Martha sneered, adjusting her shawl. "Marching out of the courthouse like she owns the territory. Just a fat mail-order bride trying to steal land from rightful men. Disgraceful. She ought to know her place." The other 2 women snickered. A cruel, sharp sound. Clara stopped. She could have kept walking. She had kept walking 100 times before. She was used to ignoring them. It was the safe thing to do. But not today. Today she had left her ledger in the courthouse. She had drawn a line in the sand. Clara turned. She stepped off the boardwalk. She walked straight into the middle of the dusty street. She stopped halfway, placing herself directly between the women and the rest of the town. People stopped. A man carrying a feed sack paused. A cowboy adjusting his saddle turned to look. Clara looked directly at Martha. "Martha," Clara said. Her voice carried. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. Martha stiffened. Her parasol dipped. "You whisper behind your hands," Clara said clearly, explicitly projecting her voice so the entire street could hear. "But I will speak to you in the open. You mock my size. You mock my origins. You think that because my body does not fit inside your tight corsets, I am somehow lesser. Let me educate you right now on the reality of the world we live in." The street went dead silent. "Equality doesn't just appear from thin air," Clara declared, her words striking like a hammer on an anvil. "It is built by respecting other people's labor and basic humanity. You can mock my origins and my size all you want, but you cannot deny a fundamental human right. A woman's sweat equity holds the exact same value as a man's on this earth." Martha's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "My heavy body carried the timber that keeps those cattle alive," Clara continued, unyielding. "My calloused hands dug the well that keeps the soil from turning to dust. Your prejudice is a poison that blinds you to the truth of hard work. I demand to be judged by the assets I produce, not the cruelty of your gossip. Anything less is a violation of my right to exist on this land." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Clara held Martha's gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she turned. She continued her walk down the street, heading back to her ranch. Her head was high. Her back was straight. 50 yards away, leaning against the wooden post of the saloon, stood Caleb Lawson. He had seen the whole thing. He had heard every single word. He had watched the town women gang up on her. He had seen the cruelty in their eyes. And he had stayed leaning against his post. He hadn't stepped off the boardwalk. He hadn't stood beside her. He just watched her fight her own battle. As Clara disappeared down the road, Caleb looked down at his boots. A burning, terrible shame twisted in his gut. A physical sickness. He was a man who prided himself on protecting the weak, on knowing right from wrong. But he had let the rumors infect him. He had stood by while a good woman was publicly shamed. He pushed off the post. He needed a drink, but he knew whiskey wouldn't wash the shame out of his mouth. It was close to midnight. The wind howled around the eaves of the Thornton Ranch. Inside, Clara was sitting by the dying fire, mending a torn canvas sack with a heavy bone needle. A sharp knock broke the silence. 3 quick raps on the heavy wooden front door. Clara froze. The needle stopped halfway through the heavy fabric. She didn't get many visitors, and she certainly didn't get them at midnight. She set the sewing aside. She walked to the door. She didn't ask who it was. She lifted the heavy iron bar and pulled the door open. Caleb Lawson stood on the porch. The mountain man. The overseer Amos had brought to intimidate her. He was holding his hat in his hands. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face. He looked cold. But he didn't look threatening. He looked restless, like a man who had been riding in circles trying to outrun a bad thought. "Mr. Lawson," Clara said. She didn't invite him in. She kept her hand on the doorframe. Caleb looked at her. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the strength in her jaw. "I didn't come with Sterling," Caleb said roughly. His voice was low, gravelly. "I came alone." "It's late," Clara said. "What do you want?" Caleb hesitated. He looked out at the dark property. Then he looked back at her. "The north well," Caleb said. Clara frowned. "What about it?" "Why did you dig it facing north?" Caleb asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine, desperate question. "The ground there is solid rock 3 feet down. It's the hardest dig on the property. Anyone else would have dug by the creek." Clara looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes. A scout's curiosity. She loosened her grip on the doorframe. "Because the creek dries up in July," Clara said quietly. "But the snow melt from the northern ridge runs deep underground. The rock acts as a natural cistern. You dig through the rock. You hit water that never freezes in winter and never dries in summer." Caleb stared at her. It was the exact right answer. It was the answer of someone who understood the land better than the men who claimed to own it. He nodded once, slowly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. He put his hat back on his head. He turned. He walked off the porch and disappeared into the cold, dark night. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the wind. The morning sun hit Harrow Creek like a dull brass coin. Caleb Lawson was already moving. He didn't sleep much. The shame in his gut from the day before had kept him awake. He kept hearing Clara's voice in the street. Equality doesn't just appear from thin air. He walked into the General Mercantile. The bell above the door jingled. The store smelled of coffee beans, oiled leather, and peppermint sticks. Mr. Higgins, the clerk, was sweeping the floor behind the counter. He was a nervous, thin man, married to the woman who had mocked Clara on the street. "Morning, Caleb," Higgins said, leaning on his broom. "Need supplies for the mountain?" "No," Caleb said. He walked right up to the counter. He planted his large, scarred hands on the polished wood. "I need to see the ledger books for the Thornton account. Going back 2 years. Higgins blinked. He looked uncomfortable. "Well now, Caleb, that's private store business. Amos Sterling handles the estate now." Caleb leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace of a man who lived with grizzly bears was enough. "I am the legal overseer hired by the bank," Caleb said flatly. "I need to verify the agricultural purchases. Pull the books, Higgins. Now." Higgins swallowed hard. He set the broom down. He fumbled under the counter and pulled out 3 heavy, dust-covered ledgers. He slid them across the wood. Caleb opened the first one. March 1876. The month Clara arrived. He ran his thick finger down the columns of tight, cursive writing. March 18th. Arthur Thornton account. 50 pounds winter wheat seed. 2 steel plowheads. 1 coil heavy wire. He flipped to the next month. April 12th. Arthur Thornton account. 3 bottles livestock liniment, 1 heavy-duty block and tackle. Caleb looked up at Higgins. "Arthur Thornton was bedridden by April of 76, wasn't he?" Caleb asked. Higgins looked away. He picked up a rag and started wiping the counter. "He was. Terrible cough. Couldn't stand for more than 5 minutes. So he didn't buy the plowheads. He didn't load the 50-pound sacks of wheat seed." "No," Higgins muttered. It was the wife, Clara. She'd bring the wagon around back, load it herself, paid cash mostly, put the heavy tools on Arthur's credit. Caleb stared at the page. The truth was written in black ink. The town knew. Higgins knew. Martha knew. They all knew the fat mail-order bride was doing the work of 3 grown men. But it was easier to mock her. It was easier to laugh at her size than to admit their own inadequacy. Caleb closed the ledger with a heavy thud. He walked out of the store. He untied his roan horse and rode straight out to the Thornton ranch. He didn't bring Amos Sterling. He didn't bring the bank's paperwork. He just brought himself. Clara was out in the garden. She was turning the soil with a heavy iron spade. It was back-breaking work. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing thick, muscular forearms. She saw Caleb riding up. She didn't stop digging. She drove the spade into the dirt with a sharp crunch. Caleb dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post. He walked over to the edge of the garden and took off his hat. He stood there for a minute, just watching her work, the rhythm of it, the undeniable power. "You're early for an eviction notice, Mr. Lawson," Clara said without looking up. She tossed a clump of dark earth aside. "I didn't come to evict you," Caleb said. Clara stopped. She leaned on the handle of the spade. She looked at him from under the brim of her hat. "Then why are you here?" "I went to the mercantile this morning. I looked at the receipts." Caleb gripped the brim of his hat. It was the hardest thing in the world for a proud man to admit he was wrong. But Caleb was an honest man above all else. "You bought the seed. You bought the plows. Arthur never left that house." "No, he didn't." "I asked you about the well last night," Caleb continued. "I spent my whole life learning how to read the land. It takes a master to know where that underground water runs. You engineered this entire ranch, didn't you?" Clara looked at him. She saw the shift in his eyes. The walls were coming down. "I learned farming in Ohio," Clara said quietly. "The dirt is different there, wetter, richer. When I came to Montana, I had to unlearn everything. I sat on the porch for 3 months and just watched the way the wind moved the dust. I watched which grasses died first in the heat. Then I went to work." Caleb shook his head slowly. A sad, bitter smile touched his lips. "They told me you were lazy," Caleb said, his voice laced with regret. "When Sterling sent for me, he said you were a heavy, stubborn mail-order bride who was ruining the land. That was the map they gave me." Clara didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. "And you believed them," she stated. "I did," Caleb admitted. He looked her right in the eye. "Because I'm a fool who let anger make him blind. They called you a fat mail-order bride. But what I'm looking at standing in this dirt is a master agricultural engineer." Clara's grip on the spade tightened. It was the first time a man in this territory had spoken to her with absolute, unvarnished respect. Not pity, not mockery, respect. But Clara was not a woman who let herself be easily swayed by a compliment. She had to make sure he understood the root of the issue. "Mr. Lawson," Clara said. Her voice was firm, carrying a weight of explicit instruction. "You need to understand something clearly. Their judgment of my body is a measure of their own limitations, not my value. When people weaponize a woman's physical appearance against her, they do it to strip her of her humanity. They want to make it easier to steal from her. My worth is innate. It does not fluctuate based on the town's gossip or their cruel standards." Caleb listened. He absorbed every word. "You are right," Caleb said softly. "It was theft, and I was standing there letting them hold the bag." "Are you still holding it?" Clara asked. "No, ma'am," Caleb said. "I dropped it." They stood there for a moment. The wind blew across the newly turned soil. It smelled like spring, like beginnings. But beginnings in Harrow Creek never came without a fight. Late that afternoon, Caleb rode back into town. He tied his horse outside the saloon. The air inside was thick. It smelled of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and sweat. It was dark, the windows covered in grime. Amos Sterling was sitting in a back booth. He had a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the table. He saw Caleb and waved him over, a slick, greasy smile on his face. Caleb walked over. He didn't sit down. "Caleb, my boy," Amos purred. He slid a glass of amber liquid across the scarred wood. "Drink up. We have business to conclude." Caleb looked at the glass. He didn't touch it. "What business?" "The Thornton assessment," Amos said, leaning back, tapping his cigar against an iron ashtray. "The judge is dragging his feet because Clara made a scene in the street yesterday, spewing some nonsense about equality and labor. We need to shut that down fast." Amos reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper and a fountain pen. He set them next to the whiskey. "I've drafted the report for you," Amos said smoothly. "All it says is that, in your professional opinion as an independent scout, Clara Thornton lacks the physical stamina, the mobility, and the mental acumen to manage an estate of that magnitude. It states that the property is at severe risk of ruin under her care." Caleb stared at the paper. It was a death warrant for Clara's livelihood, built entirely on a lie. "You want me to sign a fraudulent document?" Caleb said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "I want you to do your job," Amos snapped, losing his smile. "I'm paying you. The bank is paying you. You sign the paper, the judge gives the land to Silas, and Clara gets sent packing back east where she belongs. It's clean. It's legal." "It's a lie," Caleb said. "The property value has tripled. She built the barns. She dug the well." Amos sneered. He stood up, leaning across the table. His breath smelled of rot. "Nobody cares what a fat mail-order bride built, Caleb," Amos hissed. "The town doesn't care. The bank doesn't care. She is an embarrassment to look at. Now you sign the paper, take your money, and go back to your mountain. Or I will make sure no one in this territory ever hires you for scout work again." Amos shoved the pen toward Caleb. Caleb looked at the pen. He looked at Amos. He thought about the 50-pound sacks. He thought about the cold, lonely mornings. He thought about a woman standing in the dusty street, demanding her basic human right to exist. Caleb Lawson slowly reached out. His large, scarred hand hovered over the table. He had a choice to make, and he knew, once he made it, there would be no going back. The Harrow Creek Town Hall doubled as the church on Sundays. It was a drafty wooden building. It smelled of old pine, cold ash, and damp wool. Tonight, it was packed. Every pew was full. Men stood in the back, leaning against the rough-hewn walls. Women sat with their hands folded tightly in their laps. They were all here for a show, a public execution of a woman's pride. Clara Thornton sat in the 3rd row. She sat alone. She wore her heavy blue dress. Her back was perfectly straight. She held her brown leather ledger in her lap. She didn't look at the people whispering behind her. She didn't let them see her sweat. Up at the front, standing behind a sturdy oak podium, was Amos Sterling. He wore a fresh suit. His hair was slicked back with heavy oil. He looked like a man who had already counted his money. Beside him sat Silas Thornton, Arthur's brother. Silas had arrived on the afternoon train from Chicago. He looked soft. His hands were clean. He looked nervously at the crowd, clearly out of his element in the rough Montana territory. At exactly 7 o'clock, Amos cleared his throat. He struck a wooden gavel against the podium. The murmurs died down. "Citizens of Harrow Creek," Amos began. His voice was smooth, practiced. "We are gathered tonight to resolve a matter of local commerce, the Thornton estate." Amos gestured to Silas. Silas offered a weak, polite nod to the room. "As you know, Arthur Thornton passed recently," Amos continued. "He left a massive, complex agricultural property, a property vital to the economic health of this valley. By law, the estate falls to his blood heir, Mr. Silas Thornton." Amos paused. He let the words hang. He looked down at Clara. "Now, Arthur's widow currently occupies the property," Amos said. His tone shifted. It dripped with false pity. Clara was brought here as a mail-order bride, a companion for a sick man. We all recognize her, attempt to help. But we must be realistic. A few chuckles rippled through the back of the room. Clara kept her eyes locked on Amos. Running a ranch of that magnitude requires a swift step, Amos said, raising his voice. It requires agility. It requires stamina. Let us speak plainly. Clara is a heavy woman. She is sluggish. She does not possess the physical fitness nor the mental acuity to manage a commercial cattle operation. It is dangerous to let her try. For the sake of the town's economy and for her own safety, the bank is transferring full control to Silas immediately. Silas stood up. He looked uncomfortable, but he recited the lines Amos had clearly fed him. "I bear no ill will toward the widow," Silas said. "But a woman of her stature belongs in a quiet parlor, not managing a frontier ranch. It is simply a matter of physical reality." The crowd murmured in agreement. Martha, sitting a few rows back, nodded enthusiastically. Amos smiled. He raised the gavel to make it official. "Wait!" The word wasn't shouted, but it cut through the room like a rifle shot. Every head turned toward the back of the hall. Caleb Lawson stood leaning against the double doors. He pushed himself off the wood. He took off his wide-brimmed hat. He didn't look like a man who belonged in a church. He looked wild. He looked angry. He walked down the center aisle. His heavy boots thumped against the floorboards. The crowd parted for him. No one wanted to get in the mountain man's way. Caleb walked right past Clara. He stopped at the front of the room. He looked at Silas. He looked at Amos. "I was hired by the bank to assess the Thornton property," Caleb said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Amos's smile faltered. "Caleb, we discussed this. Your report is due tomorrow. This is a public meeting." "I'm giving my report right now," Caleb said. He turned around. He faced the town. He looked at the men who had laughed. He looked at the women who had whispered. "I spent my life tracking. Surviving," Caleb said. "I know how to read the truth of a thing. And the truth is, every single one of you is a liar." The room gasped. Amos slammed his gavel. "Order! You will not insult this town." Caleb ignored him. He pointed a scarred finger at the crowd. "You sit here and you mock her body," Caleb said, his voice rising, filling the cavernous room. "You sneer behind your fans and call her a mail-order bride. You judge her right to exist based on whether she fits into your narrow, cruel little standards of what a woman should look like." Caleb turned and looked directly at Clara. For the first time, his eyes were completely soft, completely open. Then he looked back at the town. "Look at her hands," Caleb demanded. "Look at the calluses on her palms. She outworks any 3 men in this room. While you were sleeping, she was pulling calves out of the ice. While you were drinking in the saloon, she was digging a well through solid rock. You call her slow, you call her heavy. I call her the strongest damn person I have ever met." Caleb took a step toward Amos. Amos shrank back. "A woman's worth isn't determined by her waistline," Caleb declared loudly, ensuring every person heard the lesson. "It is measured by her character, by her grit, by the undeniable reality of what she builds with her own 2 hands. Evaluating a human being based on their physical appearance is the coward's way of avoiding the truth." He looked back at Clara. "For this land, and for the truth, she is enough," Caleb said. The words rang out, absolute and final. "She is more than enough. She is twice the man any of you will ever be." Dead silence fell over the church. Amos was trembling with rage. "You are fired, Lawson. Your assessment means nothing. The law favors the bloodline. Silas takes the ranch tomorrow." "No, he doesn't." It was Clara. She stood up. She didn't rush. She smoothed her heavy cotton skirt. She picked up her ledger. She walked down the aisle and stood right beside Caleb. She didn't hide behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him. She looked at Silas Thornton. "Mr. Thornton," Clara said smoothly, "are you aware of the Montana Territory Homestead provision of 1872 regarding disputed agricultural improvements?" Silas blinked. He looked at Amos for help. Amos looked pale. "I didn't think so," Clara said. "The law states that if a non-titled resident can prove substantial, uncompensated capital improvement to a property, the assets of that property must be legally frozen. They are frozen until a federal judge can determine fair compensation. No cattle can be sold. No seed can be planted. The ranch stops." Silas turned to Amos in a panic. "Is that true? If the ranch stops through the spring, we lose the entire year's profit." "She's bluffing," Amos hissed. "She has no proof." Clara held up the brown leather ledger. "I have 2 years of daily verified accounts," Clara said. Her voice was ice. "I have the exact cost of every nail, every seed, every hour of labor." Judge Aldridge officially entered it into the court record yesterday morning. Amos stared at her. The trap had sprung, and he was caught in it. "If you try to evict me tomorrow," Clara said to Silas, "I will file the injunction. The ranch will sit empty. The crops will rot. The cattle will starve. You will inherit a graveyard. Or you can sit down with me like a civilized human being, and we will discuss a legal partnership." Silas looked at the furious town banker. He looked at the giant mountain man standing guard. And he looked at the brilliant, unyielding woman holding the ledger. We will discuss a partnership," Silas stammered. Amos threw his gavel down in disgust and stormed out the back door. The meeting was over. The townspeople filed out in stunned silence. They didn't look at Clara. They didn't whisper. They just left. Outside, the night air was bitterly cold. Clara stood on the church steps. She pulled her shawl tight around her broad shoulders. She looked up at the stars. She breathed in the clean, sharp air. Caleb walked out behind her. He put his hat on. He stood next to her for a moment. He didn't speak. He just existed in the space beside her. "I should have said something yesterday," Caleb said quietly. "In the street, when they cornered you." "Yes, you should have," Clara said. She didn't sugarcoat it. "I let a lie make me a coward," Caleb said. "I'm sorry." Clara turned to look at him. She saw the deep regret etched into his weathered face. "Apologies are just words, Caleb," Clara said softly but firmly. "They are only useful when they are accompanied by a change in behavior. Tomorrow is when the real fight starts. The paperwork. The judge. Amos won't stop." "I know," Caleb said. "Are you going back to the mountain?" Caleb looked at her. He looked at the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. "No," Caleb said. "I'm staying right here." The scratching of the pen was the only sound in the room. It was 6 in the morning. Caleb Lawson sat at a small desk in his rented room above the saloon. He had been writing since midnight. He wasn't a man of many words. He preferred action. He preferred the silent communication of a tight saddle girth or a well-placed campfire. But today, words were the only weapons that mattered. He dipped his steel nib into the inkwell. He finished the final sentence. He signed his name at the bottom of the 5th page. It was his official property assessment. He didn't write about feelings. He wrote about facts. He detailed the architectural integrity of the winter barn. He mapped out the deep water well. He calculated the exact survival rate of the winter herd. And at the bottom of page 4, he wrote the final number. The Thornton Ranch had increased in value by 287%. All of it, every single penny of that increase, was directly attributable to Clara Thornton. He blew on the ink to dry it. He folded the thick parchment. He shoved it into his leather coat. By 9 o'clock, the sun was fully up. The town of Harrow Creek was awake, and it was nervous. Judge Aldridge's chambers were cramped. The room smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and tension. The judge sat behind his desk. Clara sat in a straight-backed wooden chair. She wore her ledger on her lap like a shield. Caleb stood right behind her. He didn't hover. He simply stood tall, an unmovable object in the small room. On the other side of the desk sat Silas Thornton. Next to him, looking frantic and desperate, was Amos Sterling. I have reviewed the petition for the estate freeze, Judge Aldridge said. He adjusted his spectacles. It is legally sound. Mrs. Thornton's ledger is meticulous. It's a forgery, Amos blurted out. She wrote it all last week. You can't trust the word of a mail-order bride. She has a vested interest in lying. Caleb stepped forward. He reached into his coat. He dropped his 5-page assessment onto the judge's desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. That is my independent assessment, Caleb said, commissioned by the bank, paid for by Mr. Sterling. I spent 3 days inspecting the property. I checked the town receipts. The ledger is entirely accurate. Clara Thornton engineered a 287% increase in the property's value. Amos turned white. You traitor! I hired you to... You hired me to lie, Caleb interrupted smoothly. I don't lie. The report is signed and legally binding. The judge picked up the report. He read the summary. He looked over his glasses at Silas. Mr. Thornton, the judge said, the law is clear. If you take this land, you owe Mrs. Thornton fair market compensation for her labor and capital improvements. Given this assessment, that number is staggering. It would bankrupt the estate just to pay her out. Silas rubbed his face. He looked at Clara. He looked genuinely lost. I don't understand, Silas said weakly. Arthur wrote me when he first got sick. He said he bought a bride to nurse him. He said she was just a simple woman to cook and clean. How did she build all this? Clara stood up. She didn't look at Amos. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at Silas. This was the moment. The ledger was the proof, but the truth had to be spoken aloud. Silas, Clara said. Her voice was firm. It commanded absolute attention. Arthur didn't buy a nurse. He married a human being, and you need to understand exactly what that means. Silas swallowed hard, shrinking back slightly in his chair. The current law might allow you to strip a widow of her home simply because you share a bloodline with a dead man, Clara declared explicitly, making sure every syllable landed. But basic human rights dictate that no one's labor should be exploited without fair compensation. You came here expecting to brush me aside because society told you a heavy woman is a useless woman. That is a lie. She took a step closer to the desk. Respecting women isn't just about tipping your hat or holding the door open for us, Clara continued, educating him with fierce clarity. It is about paying us fairly for the land we have bled to cultivate. It is about recognizing that my sweat has the exact same value as yours. You cannot demand the fruits of my labor while denying my humanity. That is theft. Plain and simple. Silas stared at her. The ignorance was draining out of his eyes, replaced by a sudden, stark realization. I never meant to steal from you, ma'am, Silas whispered. Objection, Amos shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. He was sweating profusely. This is emotional manipulation. The assessment is biased. Caleb Lawson has clearly been compromised by the widow. We demand a second impartial witness to verify these absurd claims of her labor. I believe I can help with that. The door to the chambers swung open. Standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on her carved wooden cane, was Sage Mitchell. Amos rolled his eyes. Oh, for God's sake. An old half-breed widow? She isn't a credible witness. She doesn't even own property. Judge Aldridge banged his fist on the desk. Watch your mouth in my chambers, Amos. Come in, Mrs. Mitchell. Sage hobbled into the room. She looked at Amos with ancient, glittering eyes. I don't own property, Sage said. Her voice was thin, but it carried the weight of the mountains. But I own my memory, and my memory is long. I was here before you were born, Amos Sterling. I will be here when you are gone. Sage turned to the judge. I swear an oath before God, Sage said clearly. I watched Clara Thornton dig that north well in the freezing rain of November. I watched her haul the timber for the winter barn in January. Arthur Thornton never left his bed. Every nail, every seed, every drop of sweat on that ranch belongs to the woman standing right there. Sage pointed a crooked finger at Clara. You want a second witness, Amos? Sage asked, turning her sharp gaze back to the banker. Put me on a stand in a public courtroom. I will tell the whole territory exactly what I saw. And I will tell them exactly how the town banker tried to steal a widow's land by calling her fat. Amos Sterling opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked at the judge. The judge was glaring at him. He looked at Silas. Silas was actively inching his chair away from Amos. The plot was dead. It had crumbled into dust. Your Honor, Silas said quickly. He stood up. He smoothed his vest. I have no desire to go to court. I have no desire to steal from this woman. I believe a compromise can be reached. A legal partnership. Judge Aldridge nodded slowly. He picked up his pen. I strongly suggest you draft that partnership today, Silas, the judge said. Because if this goes to trial, I will ensure Mrs. Thornton owns every blade of grass on that property. Amos Sterling didn't wait to be dismissed. He turned and fled the room, slamming the door behind him. Clara stood in the quiet office. She looked at her ledger. She looked at Sage, who offered a small, proud smile. And then she looked back at Caleb. The mountain man was leaning against the wall. He had his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at Clara Thornton. He didn't see a mail-order bride. He didn't see a town joke. He saw a titan. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Lawson knew exactly where he belonged. The sound echoed across the valley. Thwack! 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 It was the sound of a heavy iron hammer driving nails into cured pine. It was rhythmic. It was steady. It was the sound of a man working off a debt he couldn't pay with money. Clara stood on her back porch. She held a steaming mug of black coffee. She watched the barn. Caleb Lawson was up on the western slope of the roof. He had been up there since dawn. He hadn't knocked on the door. He hadn't asked for permission. He had simply ridden in, unloaded a bundle of cedar shingles, and climbed the ladder. The western corner of that roof had a bad leak. Clara knew it. She had written it in her ledger back in February. Needs repair before the April rains. She just hadn't found the time or the energy. Caleb found it. He worked with a quiet, brutal efficiency. He didn't waste a single motion. He pulled a nail. He set the shingle. He drove it home. Clara watched him for a long time. She didn't feel a sudden rush of romance. She wasn't a girl in a dime novel. She was a 38-year-old widow who had fought a whole town just to keep the dirt under her boots. But watching him work, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. She felt lighter. Just for a moment, the immense crushing weight of holding the entire world on her shoulders eased. Someone else was carrying a piece of it. By noon, the sun was high and hot. The hammering stopped. Caleb climbed down the wooden ladder. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a scarred hand. He walked over to the water pump by the trough. He pumped the iron handle, splashing cold mountain water over his face and neck. Clara walked off the porch. She carried a fresh cup of coffee and a thick slice of salted ham wrapped in a clean cloth. She walked up to him. She held out the food. Caleb looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough from the dust. You didn't have to fix the roof, Caleb, Clara said. I know. He leaned against the wooden fence post. He took a bite of the ham. He chewed slowly. He was a man who took his time finding the right words. Clara let him find them. She was good at waiting. Fixing a roof doesn't fix what I did, Caleb said finally. He didn't look at the sky. He looked right into her eyes. But it keeps the rain out while I try. Clara crossed her arms over her chest. You stood up in that church. You put your name on a legal document defending my work. You didn't have to do that either. I did, Caleb said. The words were heavy. I owed it to the truth, and I owed it to you. He set the coffee cup down on the fence rail. He turned his whole body to face her. Clara, listen to me, Caleb said. His voice was steady, but there was a raw edge to it. I owe you a real apology. Not just for being quiet in the street, but for what I let happen in my own head. Clara didn't interrupt. When Amos sent for me, he told me you were a fat mail-order bride, Caleb said, refusing to sugarcoat his own failure. He said you were lazy. He said you were a burden, and I believed him. I let my own bitterness make me blind. I judged your worth based on the shape of your body before I even met you. He took a deep breath. Ignorance made me an accomplice to your emotional abuse, Caleb stated clearly, ensuring the lesson was spoken aloud. True humanity and compassion start by actively rejecting blind prejudice. I failed you there. I let their cruel standards dictate my respect. I am sorry, deeply. It was a failure of my character. Clara held his gaze. She didn't offer a quick, easy forgiveness. Easy forgiveness meant nothing. It was a failure, Clara agreed softly. When people judge a woman's capability by her physical size, they strip away her humanity. They turn her into an object to be dismissed. It is a very old, very cruel trick, and it is dangerous when good men fall for it. I won't fall for it again, Caleb said. I need to know that for a fact, Clara said. Her voice grew firm. If you are going to be on this property, if we are going to work this land together until the legal matters are settled, we have rules. Caleb nodded. Name them. Rule 1, Clara said, holding up a finger. Absolute transparency. If you hear a rumor in town, you don't chew on it in the dark. You bring it to me. We look at it in the light. Agreed. Rule 2, she continued. If you disagree with how I'm running a section of this ranch, you tell me to my face. We argue it out like professionals. You do not go behind my back to Silas or Amos or anyone else. Agreed. Rule 3, Clara said. She stepped a fraction closer. You never pity me. I am a capable woman. I do not need a savior. I need a partner who pulls his own weight and respects mine. Caleb looked at the fierce, undeniable strength in her face. I don't pity you, Clara, Caleb said quietly. I admire you. I admire you more than anyone I have ever met. The wind blew across the yard. It rustled the newly green leaves on the cottonwood trees. Before Clara could answer, a buggy rolled up the long dirt driveway. It was Silas Thornton. He was alone. No Amos Sterling. No lawyer. He pulled the horse to a stop. He climbed down from the buggy. He looked different today. The arrogant posture was gone. The fancy city coat was dusted with Montana dirt. He walked up to Clara and Caleb. He took off his hat. Mrs. Thornton, Silas said. He looked at the barn. He looked at the well. He looked at the miles of tight, straight fencing. Mr. Thornton, Clara said neutrally. I spent the morning at the courthouse, Silas said. He cleared his throat. It looked like the words hurt to say, but he forced them out anyway. I read the full ledger, every page. I read Mr. Lawson's assessment. I even went to the mercantile and spoke with Mr. Higgins. He looked back at Clara. The shame in his eyes was genuine. Arthur didn't build this. You did, Silas said. I came out here expecting a helpless widow. I was told lies about your nature and your abilities. I let prejudice cloud my judgment. Prejudice usually does, Clara said. I fired Amos Sterling this morning, Silas announced. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Clara remained perfectly still. He is no longer representing the bank regarding this estate, Silas continued. I have drafted a new proposal. A partnership. I have no business running a ranch. I live in Chicago. I want to offer you a 5-year profit-sharing agreement. You run the ranch. You take 60% of the gross. In 5 years, you have the ironclad option to buy my portion of the deed at a fixed current market price. It was a total victory. It was everything she had fought for. Clara looked at Silas. You are giving me control of the estate. I'm not giving you anything, Silas corrected softly. You earned it, every inch of it. The paperwork is with the judge. You can review it whenever you are ready. Silas put his hat back on. He offered a short, respectful bow to Clara. He nodded to Caleb. Then he got back in his buggy and drove away. Clara stood in the yard. The sun beat down on her shoulders. She had won. The land was safe. Her work was recognized. She turned to Caleb. He was watching her. A slow, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. 60%, Caleb said. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Thornton. Clara looked at the newly repaired barn roof. She looked at the man standing beside her. I know what my labor is worth, Clara said. May came to Harrow Creek like a deep breath after a long freeze. The snowmelt rushed down the mountain creeks. The wild prairie grass turned a brilliant violet green. The mud dried into hard, workable dirt. Clara Thornton sat in Judge Aldridge's office. She held a fountain pen. The black ink glistened on the heavy parchment paper. She read the final clause of the profit-sharing agreement one last time. It was flawless. It secured her rights. It protected her sweat. She signed her name, Clara Maeve Thornton. She wrote it large. She wrote it bold. She didn't try to make it look small or delicate. It took up exactly as much space as it needed to. Judge Aldridge stamped the document with the official wax seal of the Montana Territory Court. It's done, Clara, the judge said, handing her a certified copy. The ranch is secure. You have 5 years to buy Silas out. With your yields, you'll likely do it in 3. Clara took the paper. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her brown leather ledger. Thank you, Your Honor, Clara said. You fought a hard battle, the judge said, leaning back in his leather chair. You shamed half the town into seeing the truth. Amos Sterling hasn't shown his face in the saloon for a week. Clara didn't smile. Winning wasn't about humiliating Amos. Winning was about survival. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Clara wanted more than just a safe harbor for herself. She wanted a lighthouse. Judge, Clara said, resting her hands on her ledger. I have a request, a legal one. Go ahead. I want to lease the small empty office at the end of the courthouse hall, the one that used to belong to the assayer. The judge frowned. It's barely a closet, Clara. Just a desk and some shelves. What do you need it for? You have a massive ranch. I don't need it for farming, Clara said. I need it for a registry, a voluntary agricultural registry. The judge looked confused. A what? Clara leaned forward. This was the most important thing she would do today, more important than signing the deed. When Amos tried to steal my land, he relied on the fact that my labor was invisible, Clara explained. Her voice was firm and rhythmic. He relied on the fact that society doesn't record the sweat of women. It doesn't record the labor of the poor or the orphans. History only remembers the names on the bank loans. She tapped her ledger. If I hadn't kept this book, I would be on a train back to Ohio right now with nothing, Clara said. I want to open an office where any laborer in this county can come and officially record their hours, their improvements, and their crop yields. A public, legally witnessed record. The judge stared at her. Clara, that is highly unusual. The county doesn't pay for that. I will pay for it, Clara said. I will pay the lease from my profit share. I will staff it myself 2 afternoons a week. She stood up. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him how the world was going to be. This office exists to ensure the voices of all laborers are permanently recorded, Clara stated, explicitly laying out the educational mandate of her plan. Whether they are women, immigrants, the poor, or orphans. Every person's labor has dignity. No human being should ever be erased from history just because society deemed them too vulnerable to matter. If we don't write down our own worth, men like Amos Sterling will write our ruin. Judge Aldridge sat in silence. He looked at the fierce, unyielding woman standing in his office. He realized, not for the first time, that Clara Thornton was a force of nature. I'll draw up the lease, the judge said softly. $1 a month. Clara nodded. Draw it up. 2 weeks later, the voluntary agricultural registry was open. It was a tiny room, but it was clean. Clara had scrubbed the floorboards herself. She had bought a massive brass-bound ledger book 5 times the size of her own. It sat open on the sturdy oak desk. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The door was open. A shadow fell across the threshold. Clara looked up. It was Samuel, the 13-year-old orphan boy she taught to read numbers. He stood in the doorway, clutching his worn cap in his hands. "Come in, Samuel," Clara said warmly. Samuel stepped inside. He looked at the massive book on the desk. "Mr. Lawson said you were down here. He said you opened a writing office." "A registry," Clara corrected gently. "It's a place to keep the truth safe." Samuel walked up to the desk. He looked at the blank pages. "What do you write in it?" Clara picked up her pen. "I write down the work people do, so nobody can ever say they didn't do it." She looked at the boy. "Have you been working over at the Miller farm this week?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said. "Mending fences, digging post holes." "How many hours?" 10 hours a day. 6 days. Clara dipped her pen in the ink. She wrote the date. She wrote Samuel's full name, Samuel Hayes. And she wrote, 60 hours of manual agricultural labor on the Miller estate. She turned the book around. She pointed to the bottom of the entry. "Sign your name right there, Samuel," Clara said. Samuel looked at the pen. He looked at Clara. "Me? But I don't own nothing. I'm just a hired boy." Clara stood up. She walked around the desk. She put her hand on Samuel's thin shoulder. "Listen to me, Samuel," Clara said, her voice full of fierce kindness. "Your labor is the most valuable thing you own. It is your sweat. It is your time. Never let anyone tell you it doesn't matter because you don't have a title to your name. Equality begins when the lowliest worker is given the exact same respect on the historical record as the richest banker." She handed him the pen. "You write your name. You claim your work." Samuel took the pen with trembling fingers. He leaned over the heavy book. His handwriting was shaky. It was unpracticed, but it was there. Samuel Hayes. He looked up at Clara. A wide, proud smile broke across his dirty face. He existed. He was on the record. "Good," Clara said. She took the pen back. "Now, we have another matter to discuss." Samuel blinked. "Ma'am?" Clara opened a drawer in the desk. She pulled out a heavy envelope. She handed it to Samuel. "What's this?" he asked. "That is a letter of introduction and a bank draft," Clara said. "It is addressed to the headmaster of the boys' academy in Helena. The draft covers your tuition, your room, and your board for the next 4 years." Samuel dropped his cap. The envelope shook in his hands. He looked terrified. "Miss Clara, I can't. I'm a farmhand. I don't belong in a fancy school in the city." "You belong wherever your mind can take you," Clara said firmly. "You are smart, Samuel. You pick up numbers faster than most grown men. I am not giving this to you as charity. I am investing in you, because one day you're going to come back to this territory and you're going to use that education to make sure no banker ever tries to steal a farm from an honest worker again." Tears welled up in Samuel's eyes. He didn't try to wipe them away. "Why are you doing this for me?" he whispered. "Because a long time ago, people laughed at me and told me I wasn't worthy of this land," Clara said. "The best way to fight a bully isn't just to punch him in the nose. It's to build a world where he has no power. You are going to help me build that world, Samuel. Now take the letter. The stagecoach leaves on Thursday." Samuel clutched the envelope to his chest. He threw his arms around Clara's wide waist, hugging her tight. Clara smiled. She patted his back with her heavy, calloused hand. From the hallway, Caleb Lawson watched. He leaned against the wooden doorframe. He had seen the whole thing. He watched Clara Thornton change the future of a boy who had been thrown away by the world. He watched her build a sanctuary of equality in a town made of mud and spite. Caleb felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of awe. He knew right then and there that he was looking at the greatest woman he would ever know in his lifetime. And he also knew that he wasn't worthy of her. The canvas saddlebags were heavy. Caleb threw them over the back of his roan horse. He pulled the leather straps tight. The leather creaked in the quiet morning air. It was June. The wildflowers were blooming across the valley floor. Purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf. It was beautiful. Caleb didn't look at the flowers. He looked at the straps. His job was done. The Thornton ranch was secure. Silas had returned to Chicago. Amos Sterling had been stripped of his local influence. Clara was the undisputed master of her own domain. She had her registry. She had her profit share. She had respect. She didn't need a mountain man hanging around. Caleb had convinced himself of this over the last 3 nights. He was a rough man, a man of violence and isolation. He had spent a decade hiding from the world because he was afraid of being hurt. Clara was a woman who stood in the center of the street and demanded the world change its shape to fit her justice. She was sunlight. He was the shadow behind a rock. He adjusted the bit in the horse's mouth. He patted the roan's thick neck. Going somewhere? Caleb froze. He turned around. Clara stood by the corner of the barn. She wore her heavy work dress. She didn't look surprised. She looked exactly like a woman who knew what was happening and was here to stop it. "The mountain," Caleb said. His voice was tight. "The job is finished here. You don't need an overseer anymore." "No, I don't," Clara agreed. She walked slowly toward him. "But I didn't realize you were leaving without saying goodbye." Caleb looked at his boots. "I'm not good at goodbyes. Never have been." "You aren't good at running away either," Clara said. "Though you seem to try it often." Caleb's head snapped up. Clara stopped a few feet from him. She crossed her arms. "Why are you packing your bags, Caleb?" "I told you," he said stubbornly. "You don't need me. You won the fight. The land is yours. You are the strongest person I know. You don't need a man to protect you." "You're right," Clara said. The words were sharp, but her tone was not angry. It was intensely serious. "I don't need a protector. I don't need a savior. I saved myself. I dug the wells. I fought the banker. I wrote the ledger." She took a step closer. "But you seem to confuse needing a savior with wanting a partner," Clara said, looking him dead in the eye. Caleb went still. "This isn't about me needing protection," Clara stated, her words an explicit declaration of equality. "It is about choosing a worthy companion. I want a partner who stands shoulder to shoulder with me, an equal, someone who respects my mind and my body, someone who knows the value of hard work and isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. I don't want you to stay because I am weak. I want you to stay because we are both strong." Caleb stared at her. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Clara," Caleb rasped, "I am a flawed man. I listened to the town. I let prejudice poison my mind before I even met you. I stood by while they mocked you." "Yes, you did," Clara said. She didn't let him off the hook. "And then you stood up in a crowded church and tore that prejudice to shreds. You filed a truthful report when Amos offered you dirty money to lie. You proved that a man can learn. A man can change." She reached out. She placed her calloused hand against his chest, right over his racing heart. "I am not asking for perfection," Clara said softly. "I am asking for you. If you want to go back to your mountain and hide from the world, get on your horse. I will not stop you. But if you want to build a life here with me in the light, then you take those saddlebags off." Caleb looked at her hand on his chest. He looked at her fierce, beautiful face. He didn't say a word. He reached past her. He grabbed the heavy canvas saddlebags. He unbuckled the straps. He hauled them off the horse and dropped them into the dirt with a heavy thud. Clara smiled, a real brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "Wait here," Caleb said. He turned and practically ran toward the barn. He grabbed his horse's reins and led the roan into a stall. Then Caleb walked out of the barn. But he didn't walk back to Clara. He walked down the long driveway. He walked all the way to the main road. He walked into town. The bank was quiet. Amos Sterling sat behind his desk. He looked tired. The loss of the Thornton estate had cost him dearly with his superiors in Chicago. The door of his office kicked open. Amos jumped. Caleb Lawson stood in the doorway. He walked up to the desk. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick stack of banknotes, $50. The advance Amos had paid him to assess the ranch. Caleb slammed the money onto the mahogany desk. "Your money," Caleb said. Amos looked at the cash. He sneered. What's this, a guilty conscience, Lawson? No, Caleb said flatly. It's a refund. I don't take dirty money, and I don't work for cowards who use prejudice to steal from women. Amos's face flushed red. You are making a terrible mistake. You have no future in this town. I don't care about this town, Caleb said. I care about the ranch. Do not ever set foot on Thornton land again, Amos. Do not look at her. Do not speak her name. If you do, I will not bother with a courthouse. I will come straight here. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, written in stone. Caleb turned and walked out of the bank. He didn't look back. When Caleb returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was streaked with violent orange and soft purple. Clara was sitting on the front porch. She was carving an apple with a small pocket knife. Caleb walked up the steps. He sat down in the wooden rocking chair next to her. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Clara. "What is this?" Clara asked. "A letter," Caleb said. "I wrote it yesterday. To the man who sent me here. The man who told me you were a lazy, fat, mail-order bride." Clara stopped peeling the apple. She took the letter. She unfolded it. She read the words Caleb had written. "You lied to me, or you listened to a lie. Either way, you sent me down here with poison in my head. Clara Thornton is the hardest-working, most brilliant agricultural mind in this territory. Her body is a testament to her endurance, not a subject for your mockery. I was a fool to believe the rumors. I failed her. I am writing this to tell you that I am staying in Harrow Creek. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be half the man she already is." Clara finished reading. She folded the letter. She didn't cry. She wasn't the crying sort, but her chest ached with a profound, overwhelming warmth. "You wrote this yesterday," Clara said. "Before I packed my bags," Caleb admitted. "I wanted to clear the record, even if I ran away." "You aren't running," Clara said. "No, I'm not." They sat on the porch in silence. The comfortable, heavy silence of two people who no longer had anything to hide. The shadows grew long, the air turned cool. "Caleb," Clara said quietly. "Yeah?" "Do you know how to carve wood?" Caleb looked at her. "I lived in the mountains for 12 years. I can carve anything. Why?" Clara pointed out toward the main road. At the entrance to the driveway, spanning across two massive pine posts, was the heavy wooden archway Arthur had put up when he first bought the land. Thornton Ranch. "I don't want the name changed," Clara said. "It is the Thornton Ranch. I am a Thornton." "All right," Caleb said. "But there is empty space on the bottom beam," Clara noted. Caleb followed her gaze. He looked at the archway in the fading light. He understood exactly what she was asking. He stood up. He pulled his heavy hunting knife from the sheath at his hip. The steel gleamed in the twilight. "What do you want it to say?" Caleb asked. Clara looked out over the land. She looked at the barn she had roofed, the fields she had plowed, the well she had dug. She thought about the cruelty of the town and the fierce, undeniable truth of her own worth. "Just the truth," Clara said softly. Caleb nodded. He walked down the steps. He walked out to the main gate. He reached up. The wood was hard, cured by the sun and the snow. But Caleb's hands were strong. He drove the blade into the pine. Carve, sweep, clean. Clara watched him from the porch. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the wood was the best sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of permanence. When Caleb finished, he blew the sawdust away from the beam. He stepped back to admire his work. He walked back up to the porch. He sat down next to Clara in the dark. He reached out, and for the first time he gently took her thick, calloused hand in his. Their fingers laced together. Two pairs of working hands, perfectly matched. Out by the road, illuminated only by the rising silver moon, the wooden archway stood tall against the Montana wind. Thornton Ranch, established 1876, C. Thornton. She was here. And she wasn't going anywhere. The lesson is timeless. Never underestimate someone based on what you see, because the strongest stories are often the ones ignored. If this story resonated with you, support the channel with a like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to continue the journey. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
As the wind settles over Harrow Creek and the dust of conflict slowly drifts back to the earth, what remains is not just the story of a ranch saved or a dispute won. What remains is the undeniable weight of truth. Clara Thornton did not fight with guns, nor with threats, nor with the loud arrogance that so often fills a room. She fought with something far more powerful: evidence, dignity, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. In a world that tried to reduce her to whispers and cruel glances, she chose to stand tall and speak plainly. And in doing so, she forced an entire town to confront not just her strength, but their own blindness. This story is not really about land. It is about recognition. It is about what happens when a person refuses to let the world define them by its shallow standards. Clara was judged for her size, her origin, her role as a woman. Yet every fence post in that soil, every drop of water from that well, every living thing on that ranch told a different story. A story of endurance, intelligence, and relentless effort. And that is where the true lesson lies. A person's value is not something granted by society's approval. It is built, quietly and consistently, through what they create, protect, and endure. There is also another truth woven into this tale: the danger of assumption. Caleb Lawson, a man who prided himself on reading the land and surviving the wild, was not immune to the poison of rumor. He believed what he was told because it was easier than seeking the truth himself. And yet, when faced with reality, he chose to change. That choice, difficult, humbling, and necessary, is a reminder that integrity is not about never being wrong. It is about having the courage to correct yourself when you are, and perhaps most importantly, this story speaks to the quiet injustices that often go unnoticed, the kind that don't make noise, the kind that hide behind polite society and whispered words, the labor that goes unrecorded, the contributions that are dismissed simply because they do not fit a certain image. Clara's ledger was more than a record of numbers. It was proof that truth, when documented and defended, cannot be erased. So what do we take from all of this? We learn that respect must be rooted in fairness, not appearance. We learn that strength does not always look the way we expect it to. And we learn that standing up for your worth, calmly, firmly, and without apology, is sometimes the most powerful act a person can make. Because in the end, the world will always try to tell you who you are. It will measure you, label you, and place you in a box that feels convenient to others. But like Clara Thornton, you have a choice. You can accept that definition, or you can build something so undeniable, so real, that no one can take it from you. And that is a kind of strength no wind can ever tear down.